As now, in line with Heritage Month in South Africa, during the week, the Harvard University Center for African Studies hosted a conversation on intellectual property and heritage. The emphasis was on the practical and legal implications of this practice. For that, we joined now by the executive director at the center, Obina Wa. She's the executive director there. Welcome and thanks for joining us. We're also joined by Darren Olivier from Adams and Adams. It's a legal firm. You deal with the legal side of this. And we're also joined by Mohammed Noor from Noordin Consulting. And you were talking about the kind of conversations you have with your clients in this regard. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming through. Abina, let's start with you. And I'm going to digress a bit to start, because we first got to know you as the head of the Steve Biko Foundation. And this is a big month for that foundation. I know you're not speaking for them anymore, but what were your takeaways from being with that foundation as the government this year especially starts to recognize Steve Biko?
You know, I think it really speaks to the importance of heritage. That was a lot of what Biko's legacy was about. It was about looking towards our past to really understand what the gifts, the benefits were, to be able to define ourselves for ourselves and to use that towards creating a just and inclusive future, really, for all of us. And I think that's part of the reason that Biko's message continues to resonate, because it does speak so much to being able to use who we are, where we come from, what we believe, to create a different type of tomorrow for ourselves.
And thank you so much for hosting such an amazing conversation, because when you talk of intellectual property, one just thinks about business, but it goes so much deeper. You were saying at the event that you reminded us about the conversation about the fight for Steve Biko's what do they call the document? The autopsy report that somebody else wanted to appropriate. Take us a bit through that conversation.
You know, it was a very difficult time. I was literally sitting at a meeting, coming out, you check your email, and there's a message from someone saying, oh, by the way, Steve Biko's autopsy is being auctioned off. And at that point, we did not know that it actually existed, that there was no original.
Neither yourself, the foundation, or the family.
No one knew, because what happened in the 80s was that the apartheid state destroyed many documents. And amongst them, we thought were Steve Biko's autopsy reports. But as it happened, the doctor who did his autopsy, Jonathan Gluckman, who did many other autopsies, such as Ahmed Timmels, he's been in the news a lot lately as well, he was very concerned that he would be raided by the police. And so he gave the documents to Maureen Steele, his then PA, for safekeeping, and she did keep it. And after she died, her children found this in the attic, and instead of doing the right thing, which would be returning it to the family, they instead chose to go ahead and to try to auction it off for their own personal benefit, along with Ahmed Timmels. And at that time, you know, being a nonprofit organization, you don't necessarily have a lot of profit.
Absolutely.
And so we actually worked with Adams and Adams. Darren led the team that really assisted us in eventually being able to get that back. And I think I'm safe to say, I don't want to speak on anyone's behalf, but for the family and the foundation, it wasn't about them wanting to make money off of it. It was about the fact that this was a piece of history, it was a piece of heritage, but it was also a very personal document. This details their fathers, their sons, their husbands' last days. And so for someone to try to sell that for their personal benefit was really, I felt, gross in many ways. And so it was about getting that back so it could be part of the national repository, but also really tell the story of his life.
I know I have three people here, but I'm going to stay with you just for context. The Harvard University Center for African Studies. Everybody, when you think about Harvard, you think the US. You have a Joburg office. How long has it been there, and why do you have these conversations?
The Joburg office officially opened last May, just after Africa Day, which we thought was fitting. And really, our mandate at the Center for African Studies in the US and here, it's about making African perspectives, African experiences, African knowledge commonplace. I think too often, both across the continent and internationally, when people think about the continent, they tend to think of two polar opposites. It's either very exotic, or it's just about object poverty. But there are multiplicity of African stories. And so our goal is really to get people together to begin to have conversations about them, to understand them, but also to facilitate scholarship and real academic understanding about the continent so that we can learn with and from one another in the global community.
Fantastic. I suspect it's a conversation all on its own for another day. Darren, you worked on the autopsy dispute. Tell us, how did that go? How were you able to win this one?
Well, I think it's interesting. It's where there's a crossover between culture and heritage, as Abena was explained, and really intellectual property laws that assist in protecting the copyright and perhaps in the document itself. There are various laws relating to what you can do and what you cannot do with that type of document.
Yeah.
So we were able to get an interdict on an urgent basis to stop the sale of the document, and then from there negotiations went on and on about the transfer of the document back to the foundation, so that it can be a national treasure, as Abeno has explained.
How are you able to make the line? You were talking at the event about appropriation and appreciation. How can you put a price tag to heritage? Well, heritage, I think, is very, very important, especially in contemporary South Africa. I mean, we all, and in fact across the world, we're seeing a move towards looking at oneself, a lot of nationalism, a lot of sovereignty coming through on all different angles, and that brings culture and heritage into play. And my take on this and where we come from is how we adapt intellectual property laws which protect intangible rights, which are capable of protecting and nurturing and even commercializing heritage. And I think it starts with preservation, and it starts with controlling. And so what we're doing is setting up systems and vehicles to, one, put the genie in the bottle, give it to the right people to manage and control, and communicate with the outside world a place where people have to seek permission or to seek guidance on how to use heritage. These right people you're communicating with, is it individuals or communities? Communities, often led by individuals. So what the key thing is, it's the community who really, I take it, own the heritage, or it's part of the heritage. So you need everyone to have a say, but of course dealing with everyone has its significant challenges. So very often within, if you're talking about indigenous communities, they have customs and laws that nominate a particular person or a group of people who are custodians of that culture, and it's them that we speak with and educate in many respects how to use intellectual property laws to assist them in that endeavor, to avoid a situation where there's a fine line between appreciation and appropriation, and just to get that balance right, so that there's appreciation of the culture. Mohammed, you had some interesting thoughts to counter some of the assertions that Darren made about trying to make claims on heritage properties, and how you have advised your clients, and sometimes it's really been difficult to make the difference. Give us some of your thoughts.
Thanks. I don't think I'm not averse at all to the idea of formatting IP to protect indigenous communities and their rights and identities, etc. I'm totally for it. But I think the issue is, it's IP. It's very interesting because IP is extremely regulated. And what are you trying to regulate? It is? Yes, I mean, it's in South Africa. I mean, globally, as an idea, as a philosophy. Yeah. Right. Okay. And what are you trying to regulate? Dignity. Okay. This conversation is about dignity. Because, why would I care whether someone uses my language in the wrong way, or your blanket, or my bank, or my shield in the wrong way? It's because of dignity. And me as an individual, I have dignity. As a family, I have dignity. As a community, as a country. So now you ask yourself, how do you then, from a conceptual perspective, try to come and regulate, quote unquote, the symbols that exist within a community, within an individual, within a family, etc. Right? And then there's also an issue of the commercialization of it. Is commercialization always bad? We think commercialization is always bad, right? Yeah. And the other issue also to that then comes is you ask the question as to who owns it, especially in the South Africa. I mean, this is a global issue where there is always, I can almost put my head on the block, there's always discord between communities and representatives. There's always a second representative, a third representative, etc. I think in the South African context, it's much more easier probably because we have legislation that recognizes certain entities like royal households, kings, etc., etc. So it makes it much easier for you from a legal perspective, and I'm treading on very thin lines here. But conceptually, it made it easier for you then to have that type of conversation. But another issue also is, in protecting culture, what is the end game of all of this work we're going to put into protecting IP? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the reality is a lot of these communities who want to protect their culture They are consumers of common culture.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And
Absolutely.
how much do they give input, whether it be commercial value, any other types of value that's into with South African culture, global culture, etc. So these are the kind of philosophical, I think, ideas or issues behind that make this process complicated.
I mean, I was really trying to move from the philosophical to the practical. But Darren, you made examples of the international firm Louis Vuitton, who used Basotho images, who used Xhosa images for their latest ranges without any conversation with the owners of that culture. But you also, what you touched on about the end game, that it's not always about profits. There can be partnerships and there can be other ways of looking at IP. Just break that down for us.
Right, I think if you chatted to Louis Vuitton, they'd have a different version completely. But I think if what I was talking about, it was a particular example has been in the press where there's a shirt that's been sold for 33,000 Rand, looks remarkably similar to the Senamarena blanket, which is highly symbolic
the Basotho blanket
of the Basotho people. Yeah. And the thing is that apart from the discussion that's absent between the leaders of the Sotho nation and Louis Vuitton, I believe that there's firstly a potential to misuse the stripes, which were not horizontal, they were going vertical. The symbolism of a giraffe that doesn't exist in the Sotho. All of these things have a propensity on a global stage to alter the perception of culture if a connection is made. So what we're looking, first of all, when we talk about preservation, is to say, how do I get that communication going? Because it can be a very positive communication.
Yeah, yeah.
And then secondly, if there is a commercial benefit to be derived from the sale, well, the story and what the point we're trying to, I think we kind of agreed on, is that, if you can get a connection between the consumer, something going back to the community, perhaps in a very good way, it can make Louis Vuitton or the likes of Louis Vuitton look exceptional. So, and in that way, you can raise the price of the garment and everyone wins. And I think it's that type of dialogue that we want to get going. And I think in South Africa, I think it's fair to say that we're pretty naive when it comes to this. And that's where we play a huge part.
Mohammed, you also touched on a very important point when you mentioned that sometimes, let's say for argument's sake, I'm going to fight for the Basotho blanket. But in terms of the commercial benefits, the blankets are produced outside of South Africa. Nobody even knows who produces them. Take us through that conversation, because half the time we feel so attached to these heritage identities and we don't know where the benefits go eventually.
I'll make an example. I grew up watching cowboy movies.
Yeah.
And in the 70s and 80s, there was a huge uproar, which we discovered now today, from indigenous Indian communities in North America who believe, and correctly so, that their cultures must appropriate, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
But despite that, growing up as a child, I knew about something called the Red Indian. I eventually read up on it, and so forth, and so it doesn't always mean when there's misappropriation that is necessarily negative. And we take from other perspective, a lot of us as South Africans, we Zulus, Xhosas, etc., and we feel like, for example, the blanket, right, or the stripes. But when we watch a movie and we see some Arab dude running and he's wearing something red or speaking the wrong dialect, or we watch a cowboy in Indian movie, we don't sit and say, oh no.
In fact, a recent example, and this was brought up at the conversation, was the Wakanda movie.
Yeah.
And if the identities were projected correctly.
Yes. So yes, the issue is, let's say, I'm sure a lot of the identities were misrepresented and they were factually incorrect. But guess what? A lot of people who sit and watch this movie might not. And I promise you, many South Africans themselves, right, and even people who come from the indigenous communities, might not even be attuned to some of the factual inaccuracies in this. But what it did is, wow, people got a different view of Africa, a different perspective of Africa, and people saw something regarding Africa in a huge superhero blockbuster movie.
Yeah. So
I understand the issue of misappropriation and exploitation, and that is wrong. But at the same time, there are a lot of quote-unquote realities which we have to take into cognizance, and how we live in a global village, and how they say there's no any publicity is good publicity.
Obina, what was the center's takeaway from the conversation?
I think for us, the most important thing was about creating a space for dialogue and debate.
Yeah.
And the exact point is that we continue to have conversations, because culture is not stagnant. It never has been anywhere in the world. There's always been a dynamic interplay between different peoples. And I think we won't always get it correct, but when we're able to name what some of the issues are, when we're able to discuss the outcomes we want in terms of equitable development, correct representation, real partnerships, then we're able to consistently work with one another to figure out the best ways to go about doing these things in the future. And so for us, I think as the conversations continue, we'll continue to see more of the outcomes that we wanted.
Darren, you were talking about your work with the Zulu Kingdom and how they are actively trying to identify aspects of their culture that are protectable. If you're able to, please go into that space for us, but also juxtapose it to the other cultures in the country, because South Africa is a diverse country, and how far they are in terms of protecting their Pedi culture, their Tsonga culture, and so on and so forth.
So I think there's this is taking it from a corporate world into protecting culture. So, and what do you do in any organization? You have an audit of what the culture is, or what the assets are, what are the intangible assets. So,
wow.
So what you partner with an expert who identifies the various aspects of what they call culture. What is the distinctive features of, let's say, the Zulu nation, and once
their attire, how they live,
the kraals, the fighting
their
techniques,
machines,
the kings,
yeah,
the pictures of the kings. It's extremely rich, as you can imagine.
Something we call these days pop culture as well. How they live.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And once you've done that, then you map the intellectual property framework, trademarks, designs, know-how, patents, whatever might be relevant, including new indigenous knowledge legislation that's just about going through Parliament and has already been signed. There's an act in 2012. And then we work out where to spend a time and budget, because it's only going to be certain aspects of the culture that really are going to be.
You also spoke about the things that the British monarchy protects. And how far are they ahead of African identity protection processes?
No, quite significantly far ahead. But they also give a nice kind of reflection point and best practice. The British monarchy, according to Brand Finance, contributes over 45 billion US pounds.
I know we had this problem during the conversation during the week, and we're having it again, that we're time-tied, and unfortunately we have to end the conversation there. But just a quick one for each and every one of you in terms of how we can take South Africa forward in terms of heritage and IP. Darren, you can start.
I think it's just education and understanding, and then once you've got that, it flows from there.
Robina?
I think it's about recognizing there is value in our culture, in our heritage, and that it's worth protecting and promoting.
Mohammed?
It's about dignity and correcting the errors of the past, and these conversations help enforce that.
Darren Olivier, a partner at Adams & Adams, and Mohammed Noor from Nurdin Consulting. And Robina, I hope we'll be talking to you again about these conversations that you have at the center. Thank you so much. Let's take a break for now.